He slammed the can down so hard the whole counter shook. "You opened it," the storekeeper snapped, not even looking up. "I don't take back opened goods. That's the rule. Has always been the rule." The young man standing across the counter, dusty boots, shirt worn thin at both elbows, hat crushed in his hands like he was wringing the life out of it, didn't argue. He just stood there. A baby girl pressed against his chest, her face the color of old candle wax, her breathing shallow and wrong. "She can't keep it down," he said quietly. "Something in this formula is making her sick. She hasn't held food in 2 days." The storekeeper finally looked up. "Not my problem." That was the moment, right there. Not the fire that would come later, not the courtroom, not the festival where everything finally broke open. This was the moment that started all of it. Because sitting 3 feet away, on a wooden stool near the dry goods shelf, was a woman most people in Redstone Crossing had long since stopped looking at, and she was paying very close attention. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where ordinary people do extraordinary things when no one's watching, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches you, give it a like. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to Redstone Crossing, Kansas. Summer, 1883. And the woman nobody saw coming. The heat that summer sat on Redstone Crossing like a hand pressing down on the back of your neck. It never let up. The kind of heat that made dogs stop barking because even that took too much out of them. The kind that cracked the mud along the creek beds into pale, broken plates and turned the wheat fields brittle before their time. Hazel Mercer had lived through worse. At least that's what she told herself most mornings when she pulled herself out of bed, put water on for coffee, and looked at the single chair pulled up to the single table in her kitchen and remembered that there used to be 2. 3 years since Thomas died. 3 years of managing alone. She had the house, she had the small parcel of land on the edge of town, she had the money Thomas left behind. More than people assumed, less than she needed to feel entirely safe, and she had the increasingly heavy awareness that Redstone Crossing had made its mind up about her years ago and was not planning to reconsider. She was large. That's the word the polite ones used. Large. The others used crueler words, words she'd learned to let slide off her the way rain slides off oilcloth, fast, clean, leaving no trace. Or so she told herself. The truth was, they left traces. Small ones. The kind that accumulate over decades until the weight of them is its own kind of heaviness, different from the weight of her body, heavier in ways that didn't show. She walked into Calhoun's general store that Tuesday morning because she needed lamp oil and a sack of cornmeal, and because she had nowhere else to be. That was the honest truth of it. She had nowhere else to be, and a store was a place where a woman could exist for 20 minutes without anyone requiring her to explain herself. She settled onto the stool near the dry goods. Calhoun kept it there for elderly customers, which Hazel was not, but no one ever said anything when she used it, and she began working through her list in her head. Oil, cornmeal, maybe a tin of sardines if the price was reasonable. Maybe not. That's when the door opened and the young man walked in. She noticed him right away, though not for any particular reason. He was maybe 30, maybe a little younger, with the kind of face that had been handsome before something had worn it down. Not age. Something else. The kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, not on top of them. He was carrying a baby against his chest in a sling made from what looked like a cut-up flour sack, and the baby was too still. Hazel had been around enough babies to know that still was not the same as peaceful. He went straight to the counter, set a dented tin can in front of Harold Calhoun without preamble. "I need to return this," he said, "or exchange it, whatever you can do." Calhoun looked at the can, looked at the man. "It's been opened." "I know it's been opened. I opened it 3 days ago. My daughter's been sick ever since." His voice was steady, but it cost him something to keep it that way. Hazel could hear the cost. "She can't hold it down. She's losing weight. The woman at the next farm over says there's a different formula, a gentler one, that some babies do better with. I just need to exchange it for that one." Calhoun crossed his arms. "I don't do exchanges on open goods. I understand your policy." "Then you understand my answer." The young man's jaw tightened. He looked down at the baby, instinctive, the way parents do, checking without thinking, and then back up. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for an exchange. I'll pay the difference if there is one. There's no exchange on opened goods, Calhoun said again, louder this time, as if the man had misheard him the first 2 times. It's posted right there on that sign. Has been since 1871. There were 4 other people in the store. A woman picking through bolts of fabric near the window. 2 old men by the barrel of crackers who had turned to watch. A teenage boy sweeping the back corner who had stopped sweeping. Nobody said a word. Sir! The young man put both hands flat on the counter. His hands were shaking slightly. He was working very hard not to let that show. My daughter hasn't kept food down in 2 days. She's 4 months old. I don't have the money to buy a second tin on top of the one I already bought. I just need— What you need is not my concern, Calhoun said flatly, and turned back to the ledger he'd been working on before the interruption. The conversation, as far as Harold Calhoun was concerned, was over. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind where everyone in the room has decided that whatever happens next is not their business. The woman at the fabric bolt suddenly found something very interesting in a piece of calico. The old men turned back to their crackers. The teenage boys started sweeping again, slower, the broom barely moving. Hazel sat very still on her stool. She knew this silence. She had lived inside this silence for years, had been the subject of it on too many occasions to count. The silence of people deciding that something was happening to someone else, and they were grateful it wasn't happening to them. The silence of turned backs and conveniently busy hands. She watched the young man pick up the tin. His movements were careful, too careful, the way movements get when someone is holding themselves together with pure will and not much else. He tucked it under his arm. He adjusted the baby in the sling, and the baby made a small sound, thin and reedy, and his eyes closed for just a second. Then he turned to go. He was almost at the door. Hazel Mercer opened her coin purse. She hadn't planned it. There was no noble internal speech, no moment of righteous decision. She just couldn't watch him walk out that door. It was as simple and as complicated as that. She couldn't sit on that stool and watch him walk out with a sick baby and an empty option and go back to wherever he came from and figure out alone what to do next. She counted out what she had, not as much as she'd have liked. Enough. She crossed the store. She did not hurry because hurrying would have made it a spectacle. And this wasn't about spectacle. She set the coins on the counter, not in front of Calhoun, in front of the young man who had turned back at the sound of her approach and was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Part exhaustion, part wariness, part something that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. The gentle formula, she said to Calhoun, without looking at him. The one he asked about. How much is it? Calhoun looked at the coins, looked at Hazel. His expression was a complicated mixture of surprise and something close to discomfort. That's Elias Rowan's account, he said slowly. He's behind on— I didn't ask about his account, Hazel said. I asked how much the formula costs. A beat of silence. 32 cents, Calhoun said. Then take 32 cents from what I've put there and give him the formula. She paused. And give him back his tin. Another silence, longer this time. Somewhere in the store, someone shifted their weight. Calhoun did not look happy. But he reached under the counter, produced a new tin, placed it on the counter, and swept the coins into his palm. Hazel finally turned to the young man. He was staring at her. The baby had made that thin sound again, and his hand had come up automatically to rub small circles on her back, but his eyes hadn't left Hazel's face. He looked like a man trying to locate the angle, the catch, the thing that was going to make this moment cost him something. I don't know you, he said. It wasn't unfriendly. It was just honest. Hazel Mercer, she said. I live on the Mercer land, east edge of town. He was quiet for a moment. Elias Rowan. His voice was different now, stripped of the careful steadiness he'd been maintaining. This is Clara. The baby turned her head slightly at her name. Just slightly, but she turned it. She's going to be fine, Hazel said, not because she knew it for certain, but because she believed it. and she'd learned that sometimes belief said out loud was a different thing than hope kept silent. Elias Rowan nodded once. It was a small nod, barely a movement, but there was a lot in it. He picked up the new tin, shifted Clara in the sling, and walked out of the store. Hazel watched him go. Then she picked up her reduced coin purse, tucked it back into her bag, and turned to get her lamp oil and cornmeal. Behind her, she could hear the store settling back into itself. The woman at the fabric bolts, the old men, the broom that had resumed its reluctant sweeping, pretending nothing had happened. But something had happened. She just didn't know yet how much. She heard about Elias Rowan, the way you heard about most things in Redstone Crossing, sideways in fragments, from people who weren't quite talking to her, but weren't quite not talking to her either. Standing in the post office line, passing someone on the street who forgot for a moment that they'd decided not to acknowledge her. His wife had died in March. Fever, fast and mean. He'd come out from Ohio 2 years before with her and the baby on the way, and 40 acres of land purchased sight unseen from a catalog company, which meant the land was real, but the description had been ambitious. He'd worked it hard, made it something. But 40 acres without a second pair of hands was a different proposition than 40 acres with one, and a newborn without a mother was a weight that didn't distribute. People talked about Elias Rowan the way small towns talk about misfortune that hasn't touched them personally yet, with a kind of careful distance, like it might be catching. They said he was proud. They said he didn't ask for help, which in a frontier town was something people respected right up until the moment it became inconvenient, at which point they respun it as stubbornness. Nobody talked about going out there to see if he needed anything. Nobody except Hazel, who began doing it without making a decision to do it. 3 days after the store incident, she drove her wagon out to the Rowan homestead with a pot of soup in the formula tin, which she'd stopped back and quietly purchased a second of, because instinct told her 40 acres and a baby and no wife meant running low on everything eventually. What she found when she got there was a house that was holding itself together through sheer stubbornness, a fence that needed 2 new posts, a porch step that had rotted through at one end. Elias at the water pump with Clara tucked into the crook of one arm and a bucket in the other hand, trying to work the handle with his elbow, and not entirely succeeding. He looked up when she pulled in. His expression went through several things quickly: recognition, wariness again, and then a kind of exhausted calculation, like a man adding up what he could afford. "I don't need charity," he said. Not unkindly, the same way he'd said it in the store, as information, not accusation. "I brought soup," Hazel said, "and a second tin of formula so you've got backup. I'll leave them on the porch if you'd rather." He looked at her for a long moment. Clara made a sound, a different sound than before, not that thin, reedy note, but something more alive, more insistent. And he looked down at her automatically, and something in his face changed the way faces change when they're doing something they weren't planning to. "There's a chair on the porch," he said, "if you want to sit." She sat. That was the beginning of it. Nothing poetic, nothing predetermined, just a pot of soup and a chair on a porch and 2 people who had both learned in different ways what it meant to be on the outside of a room where other people were warm. The soup visits became twice a week. Then she started bringing her account books because Elias had mentioned once, just once, matter-of-factly, the way people mention things they've already made peace with, that numbers weren't his strength, that he'd gotten behind on his bookkeeping and wasn't entirely sure where his accounts stood. She offered to look at them. He hesitated exactly as long as his pride required him to, which was about 4 seconds, and then handed them over. What she found in those books made her sit quietly for a long moment before she said anything. He wasn't just behind, he was being systematically underpaid for his cattle. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious. Small amounts. A penny here, 2 cents there. The kind of discrepancy that a man juggling a homestead and a baby and grief that hadn't finished working through him might not have caught. But accumulated over 18 months of transactions, it added up to something significant. "Who buys your cattle?" she asked. "Granger outfit," he said, without looking up from where he was mending a harness. "Silas Granger's buyer comes out every 6 weeks or so." Hazel looked back at the numbers. "And you don't sell to anyone else?" "Granger's the only game for 100 miles in any direction," Elias said. You sell to him or you sell to no one. She wrote down the discrepancies in her careful hand, said nothing more about it that day. But she thought about it the whole drive home, and the thought that settled in her chest by the time she got there was not a comfortable one. Something was wrong, and it had Silas Granger's hands on it. Every person in the valley knew who Silas Granger was. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had political connections 3 counties wide, and had built his empire on a combination of hard work, strategic marriage, and the kind of flexible relationship with honesty that powerful men in frontier territories often got away with because there was no one powerful enough to call them on it. He was not a man who made enemies carelessly. He made them deliberately, and he made sure there was nothing left of them when he was done. Hazel drove home and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the numbers she'd copied out and felt, not fear exactly, something more like the particular clarity that comes when you understand what you're dealing with and what it might cost you. She was a widow with a modest piece of land, no husband, no powerful friends, and a reputation in this town that people used as a punchline when they thought she wasn't in earshot. And she had just found what looked very much like evidence that the most powerful man in Redstone Crossing was stealing from a man who had almost nothing left to lose. She put the paper in her desk drawer. She told herself she needed to think about it more before she did anything. She spent most of that night not sleeping. But the thing about small towns is that silence travels. Hazel knew this. She'd known it for years. You didn't have to say a word for a rumor to start about you. You just had to exist in a way that confused or threatened or simply interested people, and the rest took care of itself. So she wasn't surprised when the whispers started. She was maybe a little surprised by the speed. By the end of that first month, she'd heard herself described 3 different ways depending on which end of town was doing the describing. Near the church, she was a busybody widow, throwing herself at a grieving man too tired to tell her no. Near the saloon, she was something less charitable. Near Calhoun's store, the origin point, she supposed, of the whole thing, the version she heard secondhand was that she'd humiliated Harold Calhoun in his own establishment and was now insinuating herself into Rowan's business to get her hands on his land. What land, exactly, no one seemed to specify. 40 struggling acres and a creek, nobody had paid attention to. Nobody had paid attention to it until Hazel started looking at those account books. She mentioned the creek to Elias one afternoon in late July, almost carefully. The creek that cuts through your east pasture, is that on your deed? He looked at her oddly. Yes. Why? Is there documentation at the county office? Filed? There should be. My deed is filed. Why? She didn't answer right away. She picked up Clara. The baby had taken a liking to being held, and Hazel had taken a liking to holding her, which was a development neither of them had anticipated but both had quietly accepted, and she thought about how to say what she needed to say. I want you to get a copy of your deed, she finally said. The full copy, with all the attachments. I want to look at it. Elias set down his coffee cup. His eyes were steady on her face. He was smarter than people gave him credit for. She'd understood that early. He didn't miss things. He just had too many other things demanding his attention to always follow up on what he noticed. You found something in the books, he said. It wasn't a question. I found something in the books, she confirmed. A long pause. How bad? He asked. She looked at him over the top of Clara's head. The baby was making small sounds, comfortable sounds. Her fingers wrapped around one of Hazel's fingers the way babies do, with absolute certainty, no hesitation, the grip of someone who hasn't learned yet to doubt. I don't know yet, Hazel said honestly, but I think someone's been hoping you wouldn't look too close at what you own. Elias was quiet for a moment. Clara made another sound and Hazel adjusted her hold slightly, and outside the window the afternoon light was going gold and long, the way it did in late Kansas summer. Then I guess we'd better look, Elias said. It was the first time he'd said we. Hazel looked down at Clara's small, trusting grip on her finger and felt something shift inside her chest, quiet and significant, like a door she hadn't known was closed opening just slightly in the dark. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. The deed took 11 days to arrive from the county office. Elias had ridden in himself to request it, which was not a small thing. A full day's trip there and back. Clara left in the care of a neighbor woman, 2 farms over, who owed him a favor from the winter. He came back with dust in every crease of his face and a folded document tucked inside his shirt, close to his chest. The way people carry things, they've decided matter. He handed it to Hazel, without ceremony. She was already at his kitchen table with her reading glasses and the account ledger she'd been cross-referencing for the third time. Because she didn't trust first impressions of numbers any more than she trusted first impressions of people. She unfolded the deed carefully. She read it twice before she said anything. "The creek," she said. "Both banks." Elias was at the stove heating coffee that had already been heated twice. He turned around. "What about them?" "Your deed includes water rights to both banks of the Eastern Creek, full riparian rights. It's written in plain language right here in the attachment." She set her finger on the line. "Someone at the Granger outfit either doesn't know this or—" She paused. "Or they're counting on you not knowing it." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and looked over her shoulder at the document. She could feel him reading it. He read slowly, which wasn't stupidity. It was the habit of someone who'd learned that reading fast meant missing things that later became expensive. "That creek," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way voices go when a person is recalculating something in their head. "Granger's man told me last fall that the Western Bank was disputed. Said the county records were unclear, said I should stay off it until it was sorted." Hazel looked at the deed. "There's nothing unclear about this," she said. Silence in the kitchen. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its repertoire in the elm tree by the fence. Clara was asleep in the back room, a fact that registered as its own kind of gift. That particular quality of quiet in a house where a baby is sleeping peacefully, for once. "He told me to stay off my own land," Elias said. Still that quiet voice. "He told you to stay off land that controls water access for about 400 acres to the south," Hazel said, "which is currently leased by Granger." Another silence. Longer. "How long have you known this?" Elias asked. "I suspected it for about 2 weeks. I wanted the deed before I said anything." She took off her reading glasses. "I didn't want to tell you something I wasn't sure of." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the document between them on the table like it was a thing that had changed shape when he wasn't watching. "He underpaid me on 18 months of cattle purchases," he said finally. Not a question. Just repeating what he now understood. "The shortfall, I calculated, comes to about $63, Hazel said. "Give or take. It's spread across enough transactions that you wouldn't catch it without laying them all out." $63. For a man in Elias Rowan's position in the summer of 1883, $63 was not an abstract number. It was the difference between making it through winter with margin and making it through winter on nerve alone. Elias put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands flat against his face. Not dramatic, just a man taking a moment to absorb something that had rearranged what he thought he knew. "I want to go to the county land office," Hazel said, "with you. And I want to file a formal copy of this deed with the water rights explicitly noted. A second filing. So there's no question about what's on record." He lowered his hands, looked at her. "You think he'd move against the record?" "I think powerful men get comfortable," Hazel said carefully. "Comfortable men get careless, and careless men sometimes don't notice when someone's paying closer attention than they expected." It wasn't a complete answer, and he knew it wasn't. But he also understood what she wasn't saying, that she didn't know exactly what Silas Granger was capable of, only that he'd already shown he was willing to take something from a man who couldn't afford to lose it. That was enough to take seriously. "All right," Elias said. He reached across the table and folded the deed back along its original creases. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. The kind of deliberate that means a person has made a decision and has stopped second-guessing it. "We go to the county office," he said. The trip to the county seat was planned for the following Thursday. That gave them 11 days, which felt like enough time and wasn't. Because somewhere in those 11 days, Redstone Crossing began to change around them in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore together. It started small. Hazel went into the post office on a Monday, and the postmaster, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been perfectly cordial to her for 3 years, was suddenly very busy with something behind the counter and didn't meet her eyes when she paid for her stamps. On Wednesday, The woman who ran the seamstress shop crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Hazel coming. On Friday, she arrived at the Rowan homestead to find a note that had been nailed to the fence post. No signature, the handwriting deliberately disguised into blocky, graceless letters. Widow women that push into other people's business tend to regret it. Friendly warning. She pulled the note off the post, folded it once, and put it in her pocket. She did not mention it to Elias when she got inside. She should have mentioned it to Elias. She didn't because she told herself it was probably nothing, the kind of vague threat that cowards threw out when they wanted to see if it would land without leaving fingerprints. She'd encountered that kind of cowardice before. It usually ran from direct confrontation. She was right about the cowardice. She was wrong about what it was attached to. That same Friday evening, Elias came in from the south pasture looking like a man who'd had a conversation he wasn't sure how to characterize. He washed his hands at the pump, dried them on the rag by the door, stood there for a moment with his back to her. "Granger's man came by today," he said. Hazel set down the fork she'd been using to turn the pork in the pan. "Which man?" "Decker, the one who does his buying." Elias turned around. His expression was controlled in that specific way it got when he was managing something internally. He didn't come to buy cattle. What did he come for? "He came to tell me that Mr. Granger had heard I was having some money troubles and wanted me to know that if I was ever considering selling the property, Mr. Granger would be very fair about the price." Elias pulled out his chair and sat down. He mentioned the creek specifically, said the water rights situation was complicated and that trying to pursue it through legal channels would take years and cost more than I had, said it would be cleaner for everyone if I just sold. Hazel looked at him steadily. "What did you say?" "I said I wasn't selling." "And?" And Decker nodded like I hadn't spoken and said he'd relay my position to Mr. Granger and that Mr. Granger hoped I'd reconsider given... Elias paused. His jaw worked once. "Given my situation." His exact word. Situation. The fire under the pan was doing something that needed attending to. Hazel attended to it. She needed a moment to think, and the fire gave her one. "He knows we found something," she said, not turning around. Either that or he was already watching us. A pause. Or both. She turned around then. Elias was looking at the tabletop, running his thumb along a groove in the wood that had been there since before he owned the table. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than the day's work. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," she said. She said it plainly because he deserved plainness. "If we go to the county office and file that second documentation and start asking questions about the water rights, Granger's going to know it's no longer just about cattle prices. He's going to push back." "I know that. And people in this town are going to take sides. Most of them are going to take his, because most people in most places take the side of the man who can cost them something." She set the fork down on the edge of the pan. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He looked up at her. "Are you telling me we should stop?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you what I think is true. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face relaxed, just slightly, not relief exactly, but the expression of a man who's been braced for a different kind of conversation and found himself not having it. "Hazel," he said, "can I ask you something honestly?" "You can ask me anything honestly." "Why are you doing this?" He said it without accusation, without suspicion, genuine. "You didn't have to do any of this. Not the formula, not the soup, not the books." He looked down at the tabletop again. "You're going to take hits for it. You already are, I think. People are talking about you worse than before." She was quiet for a moment. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said. And then, because that was true but not complete, she added, "And because I've spent a lot of years doing the quiet thing and the careful thing and the thing that kept everyone around me comfortable, and I'm old enough now to know that it didn't protect me from anything. It just made me easier to ignore." He didn't say anything to that, but something in his eyes shifted, recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of someone who has their own version of the same wound. From the back room, Clara made a sound. A good sound. The sound of waking up, not distress. Hazel wiped her hands on her apron, went to get her, and came back with the baby balanced on one arm the way she'd learned over the past weeks, the formula already warming in the small pan she'd repurposed for that purpose. She sat down across from Elias. Clara grabbed her finger. The grip was stronger now than it had been that first day in the store. More certain, less desperate. "Thursday," Hazel said. "Thursday," Elias agreed. But Thursday had a Tuesday in front of it. And Tuesday was when Redstone Crossing showed Hazel exactly what it had decided to think of her. She walked into the Ladies' Auxiliary Society meeting. She'd been a dues-paying member for 3 years, had never been particularly welcomed, but had never been formally excluded, and walked into a room that went quieter in the specific way rooms go quiet when the person who just walked in is the person being talked about. Martha Granger was there. She was always there. Silas Granger's wife was a trim, composed woman of 53 who sat with the posture of someone who had learned a long time ago that posture was a form of armor. She had pale eyes that didn't miss things, and a way of not quite looking at you while looking directly at you that Hazel had always found unsettling. Nobody asked Hazel to leave. That would have been too direct. Instead, Vera Hutchins, who ran the meeting with the iron enthusiasm of a woman who'd found her calling in parliamentary procedure, simply said, with a cheerful lack of subtlety, that the meeting was going to focus on the upcoming Founders Festival planning and that some of the committee positions had already been filled and she hoped everyone would understand. Hazel understood. She found a chair at the edge of the room and sat in it and watched Martha Granger watch her from across the circle of women, and she thought about the note on the fence post, which she still had in her pocket. When the meeting broke up, most of the women filed out with the careful efficiency of people avoiding a situation. Hazel was gathering her things when she realized Martha Granger hadn't left. She was standing 3 feet away, holding her gloves in both hands, looking at Hazel with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Granger." A pause. Martha Granger looked at the door the other women had left through, then back at Hazel. "You're going to the county office," she said. It wasn't a question. Hazel went very still. "My husband knows things," Martha Granger said. Her voice was low and completely level. "He knows things, and he acts on them. It would be foolish to pretend you don't understand what that means." "I understand what that means," Hazel said. Another pause. Martha Granger was looking at the gloves in her hands. Her thumbs were moving over the fabric in a way that might have been nerves or might have been something she did when she was deciding something. "The Rowan property," she said carefully. "The creek. Those water rights go back to the original land grant of 1871. They're not disputed. They've never been disputed." She looked up. Her pale eyes were very direct. "Whatever you've been told to the contrary is wrong." Hazel looked at her carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha Granger put her gloves on, one finger at a time, with precision that suggested she was giving herself something to do with her hands. "I'm not telling you anything," she said. "I'm a woman having a conversation at a meeting. If you happen to hear something useful in the course of that conversation, that's not my concern." She walked out. Hazel stood alone in the empty meeting room for a full minute before she moved. She thought about what she'd just witnessed. Not what Martha Granger had said exactly, but the shape of how she'd said it. The careful phrasing, the gloves. The fact that she'd waited until every other woman was gone. There were things happening in the Granger household that Hazel did not know. She understood, in a general way, that women married to powerful men were not always powerful themselves, and that the gap between those two things could be very large and very silent. She did not know exactly what Martha Granger's life looked like from the inside. She suspected it was more complicated than it appeared from the outside, which was how it usually was. She filed the conversation away in the same place she'd filed the note from the fence post. And she went home and thought about what it meant that the wife of the most powerful man in the valley had quietly, carefully told her she wasn't wrong. The pressure on Elias escalated faster than either of them had anticipated. On Monday, his standing order at Calhoun's store was quietly flagged. A clerical issue, Calhoun said, wouldn't look at him directly. On Tuesday, 2 of the 3 neighboring ranchers who'd shared fence-mending agreements with him for 2 years suddenly found reasons they couldn't honor the arrangement this season. On Wednesday morning, Elias found 3 of his fence posts on the north pasture edge pulled up and thrown into the creek. Not fallen. Pulled. The earth around each post hole was disturbed in a specific way, the kind of way you get from deliberate effort, not weather or animal. He stood at the fence line for a while looking at it. Then he went back to the house and told Hazel. She listened. Then she said, "We can put them back." "That's not—" He stopped. "Hazel, that's not the point." "I know it's not the point," she said, "but we can still put them back. We're not going to let fence posts become the thing that stops us." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the look he got when she said something that irritated him slightly because it was also right. They put the posts back. It took most of the afternoon, the two of them working in the stubborn heat, Clara in her basket in the shade of the big cottonwood, watching them with the solemn attention of a baby who is taking notes on the world. It was hard work, harder than it needed to be because the ground had dried hard since the posts had been set originally, and getting them back in solid required more digging. Hazel's hands blistered. She didn't mention it. Partway through the second post, Elias stopped and looked at her. She was using the tamping tool with both hands, pushing it down with her weight behind it, and she was sweating in the full afternoon sun, and her blisters had broken somewhere in the last 15 minutes, and she knew it, but had decided not to think about it. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said, without stopping. He watched her for a moment. Then he took the tamping tool from her hands, not roughly, but with the particular firmness of someone who's made a decision. "Let me do this part," he said. "You hold the post." She held the post. They worked until the sun was going low and all three posts were back in the ground, solid, better than they'd been before. Hazel wrapped her hands with a strip of cloth she kept in her bag for no reason she'd been able to articulate before today. Elias watered the horses and came back and handed her a cup of water without being asked. They sat on the grass by the cottonwood. Clara had fallen asleep in her basket, one fist curled under her chin. "I need to tell you something," Hazel said. "All right." The note on the fence post, the day Decker came. She pulled it from her pocket. She'd been carrying it for a week, and handed it to him. He read it. His face did not change expression in any obvious way, but the set of his jaw did something, a slight tightening that she'd come to understand was his version of controlled anger. "Why didn't you tell me when it happened?" His voice was very level. "Because I thought it was the kind of threat that didn't mean anything." "And now?" She looked at the fence post they'd just put back in the ground. "Now I think it's the kind of threat that means exactly what it says." He folded the note, didn't give it back to her, put it in his own shirt pocket. "We leave for the county seat on Thursday," he said. "Same plan." "Same plan," she agreed. A pause. A long one. The kind of pause that sits between two people when they've done a hard thing together and haven't quite processed it yet. "Hazel," he said, not with anything in particular attached to it, just her name. She looked at him. He was looking at Clara in the basket, at her sleeping face, that small fist, the absolute trust of someone who has no idea there's anything to be afraid of. "She's gained almost a pound since I switched formula," he said. "She's been keeping everything down." "I know," Hazel said. "She looks different." "She does." A small pause. "Better." There was more in that word than the word itself contained, and both of them understood that, and neither of them said it out loud, because there are things that survive better without being spoken directly, especially early on, especially when people are still figuring out what they are to each other. Hazel finished her water, set the cup down on the grass. "I'll be here at sunup Thursday," she said. "We'll need an early start to make good time." Elias nodded. He was still looking at Clara. "Thank you," he said, "for the posts." "You did most of them." "Not just the posts," he said. She didn't answer that. She picked up her bag, said goodnight to Clara's sleeping face in the particular quiet way you say goodnight to sleeping babies, and walked to her wagon. She didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, she did, but because some moments stay cleaner when you let them be what they are without trying to see them from the outside. She drove home in the last of the evening light and sat at her kitchen table and looked at her wrapped hands and thought about what Thursday was going to bring. There was a heaviness to the thought, Not dread, something more complicated. The particular weight of knowing that something you've set in motion cannot be stopped, only carried forward. She'd started this with 32 cents on a counter in a general store. She'd thought it was a small thing, a momentary thing. The kind of thing you do because you cannot do otherwise, and then life moves on. Life had not moved on. Life had, in fact, moved directly toward the hardest version of itself, the way it tends to do when you stop pretending you don't see what's in front of you. Hazel Mercer sat at her table and looked at her blistered, wrapped hands and thought, I am 59 years old, and I am about to make a powerful enemy, and I am not sure I know everything that means. But she also thought, that baby's gained a pound. She thought, those fence posts are back in the ground, better than before. She thought, he said thank you and meant more than one thing. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and slept. Not perfectly, but enough. Thursday was coming, and she intended to be ready for it. Thursday came in gray and close, the kind of morning where the sky sits low and the air smells like something is thinking about happening but hasn't decided yet. Hazel was up before light. She fed the chickens, put water on, ate half a piece of bread standing at the counter because sitting down for breakfast felt too deliberate for a day like this. She packed the deed copy, her ledger notes, and the documented discrepancies in a canvas satchel she'd used for Thomas's business papers years ago. The leather handles had worn smooth in specific places where his hands had held it. She noticed that, the way you notice small things on days when you're trying not to think about the large ones. She was at Elias's gate by sunup. He was already in the yard, hitching the second horse to the wagon. He'd borrowed the animal from his neighbor to the north, the one who hadn't canceled the fence agreement, one of two left who hadn't. Claire was in the house with that same neighbor woman, a widow named Agnes Pruitt, who had 3 grown sons and no patience for nonsense and had agreed to the arrangement without asking too many questions, which was precisely the quality Elias needed in a person that morning. He looked up when Hazel pulled in, looked at her, then at the sky. Going to be a hot ride, he said. It is, she agreed. That was the whole of the conversation for the first hour. Not unfriendly silence, productive silence. The kind that happens between people who've run out of things to plan and haven't yet arrived at the thing they've been planning for. The county seat was called Harlan's Mill, which was what happened when a town was named after the man who built the first flour mill, and then the mill burned down and the name stayed anyway. It was bigger than Redstone Crossing by a factor of 3, with a proper courthouse, a land and deed office on the second floor of a building that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, and the particular mustiness of documents that had been filed and never looked at again. The clerk was a young man named Ambrose, who wore his hair parted too precisely in the middle and had the slightly defensive posture of someone who got complaints more often than compliments. He looked at Hazel and Elias the way clerks look at people who show up with paperwork they didn't generate themselves, with a cautious neutrality that could tip either direction. Elias put the deed on the counter. I'd like to file a formal notation of existing water rights, he said. Page 4, Attachment B. Both riparian banks of the Eastern Creek, Rowan property, Redstone Township. Ambrose looked at the deed, then he looked at Elias. Then, briefly and not very subtly, at Hazel. This was originally filed in, he checked the stamp, 79. That's right, and you want to file a secondary notation. I want it formally recorded that the water rights in Attachment B are not disputed, not pending review, and have been active and uncontested since the original filing. Elias said it the way Hazel had coached him to say it, clearly and without qualification. I also want a certified copy of this deed with that notation attached. Ambrose tapped his pen against the counter once, twice. That's a routine process, he said carefully. Takes about 3 weeks for the notation to be formally entered into the county record. I understand, Elias said. I'd like to start the process today. Another tap of the pen. Ambrose glanced at Hazel again. She was saying nothing, standing a half step back with her hands folded over her satchel, letting Elias run this because it was his land and his name on the deed, and his voice that needed to be on record as the one who'd asked. I'll need you to fill out Form 14B, Ambrose said finally. He reached under the counter and produced a document. And there's a filing fee of $1.20. Elias paid the fee. He filled out Form 14B in his slow, deliberate handwriting while Hazel stood beside him and said nothing and watched the door. Nobody came through the door. That was its own kind of information. It meant no one had gotten ahead of them. Whatever Granger's network looked like, It hadn't reached Harlan's mill before a wagon that left at sunup. When the form was complete and submitted and Ambrose had stamped it with the particular satisfaction that clerks reserve for stamping things, Hazel leaned forward slightly. "Could you tell me," she said, "who else has accessed the public record for the Rowan property in the past 2 years? That's a matter of public record itself, I believe. Who's looked at what?" Ambrose blinked. Yes, technically, it would take some time to—" "We'll wait," Hazel said pleasantly. It took 40 minutes. Ambrose disappeared into the back room with an expression suggesting he'd underestimated this visit significantly. When he came back, he had a small ledger of access records and a look on his face like a man doing math he'd rather not finish. He turned the ledger toward them. Hazel read the relevant entries. Then she read them again. The Rowan property deed had been accessed 4 times in 18 months. Once by Elias himself, the original filing review. Once by an unnamed county surveyor in the fall of 1882. And twice, both times in the past 8 months, by a man named D. Calhoun. Not Harold Calhoun of Calhoun's General Store, but Hazel had a very specific feeling she knew whose errand D. Calhoun had been running. She wrote the name down in her ledger notes without expression. Elias was looking at it too. His jaw had done that thing. "Thank you," she said to Ambrose, who had the look of a man who very much wanted this particular Tuesday to be over. They walked out into the gray morning, which had gotten grayer. Thunder somewhere to the southwest, still far off but committed to arriving eventually. Elias said nothing until they were back at the wagon. "Decker's full name," he said. "It's Daniel Decker." He looked at her. "His mother's family name is Calhoun." Hazel felt something settle into place in her chest, the way pieces do when a picture stops being fragments. "Granger sent his own buyer to review your deed records," she said, "before he sent that same buyer to your door to talk about selling. He knew exactly what the deed said." "He knew exactly what the deed said," she agreed. A pause. The thunder again closer. "He looked at my deed so he could lie to my face about my own property," Elias said. His voice was very quiet and very controlled, and underneath the control was something that had been building for a long time and was now getting its shape. "Yes," Hazel said. He stood there for a moment, not moving, looking at something across the street that he wasn't actually seeing. Then he climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Let's go home," he said. They didn't make it home before the storm. It caught them 12 miles out, the kind of summer storm that doesn't negotiate. 1 minute the air was thick and still. The next the sky opened up with a thoroughness that made the road disappear and the horses throw their heads, and every sound became the rain sound. All other sounds subsumed. They pulled the wagon under a stand of cottonwoods at the edge of someone's north field and waded it out with a piece of canvas Hazel had thought to bring pulled over them both, water still finding its way down both their necks, the satchel clutched against Hazel's chest to keep the papers dry. They sat close because the canvas required it, not uncomfortably close. The particular closeness of 2 people who've stopped noticing they're close, which is its own kind of information. "My father had a saying," Elias said over the sound of the rain. He was looking at the horses, who had settled into resigned patience the way horses do with weather. He said, "Don't fight what's already moving." Meaning? Meaning the storm's already here. You can run from it or wait it out, but you can't stop it once it's started. He meant it about weather. He paused. He probably meant it about other things, too. Hazel thought about that. "Your father sounds like he was a practical man." He was, too practical sometimes. The practical answer to some things is to walk away, and he was better at walking away than he should have been. Elias said it without bitterness, just as observation. The way people talk about their parents when enough time has passed that they can see them whole rather than just the parts that hurt. "You didn't walk away from your land," Hazel said. "No." A pause. "My wife would have." She was braver than me in that particular way. Eleanor would have marched into Granger's office and told him exactly what she thought of his fence post stunts. He said it with something that was almost a smile, but not quite. She had no patience for bullies, none at all. It was the first time he'd said his wife's name to Hazel. Eleanor. She'd known it, the way you know things in a small town, but he hadn't said it. Not in months of soup and ledgers and fence posts and the slow construction of whatever they were building between them. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Hazel said. You would have? He said, simply, without making it complicated. She would have liked you too. She had good judgment about people. He looked at his hands on the reins. Better judgment than I did, mostly. The rain was beginning to ease. Not stop, ease. The kind of easing that means the worst of it has passed and what's left is just weather rather than event. What happened with your husband? Elias asked. He asked it the same way she'd asked about Eleanor, not as an intrusion, just as a door left open. Hart, she said. 3 years ago this past April. He was 57. She looked out at the wet field, the sky going from violent gray to just gray. We had 22 years, not always easy years. He wasn't always an easy man. Were you happy? She considered that honestly. We were real, she said finally. Some of it was happy, some of it was hard. Most of it was real, which I think I value more looking back than I would have known to say at the time. He nodded at that, like it made sense to him in a way that didn't need elaboration. The rain stopped. They drove the rest of the way home in the washed-out early evening, the road muddy and the air finally, mercifully cool, and didn't talk much more, but it was a different kind of silence than the mornings, less braced, more settled. Potch. The fire came 11 days later. Hazel smelled it before she saw it. She'd been at her own property when it started, a Thursday evening in late August, the air still carrying the day's heat even as the sun went low. The smell was wrong. Too much smoke, wrong direction, and underneath it something specific, the smell of burning grass rather than burning wood, which in a dry Kansas summer meant one thing. She was on her wagon and moving before she'd finished the thought. She came over the rise that looked down onto the Rowan property, and what she saw stopped the breath in her throat. The eastern pasture was burning, not a small fire, not a cooking fire accident or a stray ember from a pipe. A wide, running fire moving west along the dry grass toward the creek, toward the water source, toward the fence line, toward the outbuildings on the south edge of Elias's land. The creek. If the fire burned to the creek bank, it would take the fencing, the feed storage on that side, and more importantly, would leave the banks exposed and damaged in ways that would complicate any formal assessment of the water rights that might be coming. Hazel understood in the cold center of a very hot moment that this was not an accident. She drove the wagon hard down the rise, already shouting. Elias was already at the fire line. She could see him, a figure in the smoke with a wet blanket beating at the advancing edge, working the kind of desperate isolated rhythm that told her he'd been at it for a while and was losing ground. He couldn't see where she was until her wagon came through the gate. "Clara," she shouted. "Agnes took her this afternoon," he shouted back. "She's not here." Something in Hazel's chest unknotted itself. She had the water barrel on the wagon. She always kept one, a habit from years of driving alone on dry roads. And she drove it as close to the fire line as the horses would tolerate before they started pulling sideways, which was their right. She jumped down before the wagon fully stopped, which she was going to feel in her knees tomorrow, and grabbed the second wet sack from the barrel. She went into the smoke. The fire had a sound she hadn't expected. Not just the crackling she'd imagined, but a deeper hiss and rush, a sound like something breathing out. The heat was immediate and physical, not like standing near a fireplace, but like being inside the fireplace. Her eyes streamed. She couldn't see Elias anymore, only the orange edge of the burn line and the smoke rolling low across what had been good grass that morning. She worked the wet sack against the ground, beating down what she could reach, moving left along the line the way she'd heard you were supposed to. Fight the edges. Don't stand in the middle. Keep moving. Her arms ached within the first 3 minutes. Her hands, still not fully healed from the blistering 2 weeks ago, made themselves known with enthusiasm. She kept moving. At some point, she lost track of how long, she heard another voice, then 2 more. She looked up through streaming eyes and saw shapes coming through the smoke from the road. A wagon she recognized as belonging to Tom Aldrich 2 farms north, and behind it 2 men on horseback, and behind them another wagon. Tom Aldrich jumped down before his wagon stopped. He took one look at the fire line and started shouting instructions at the men behind him with the efficiency of someone who'd fought grass fires before. They spread out along the line. Hazel kept beating at the grass in front of her. They worked for 2 hours. Maybe longer. Time in a fire doesn't run the same way as other time. It compresses and stretches without pattern. The fire didn't reach the creek. It came within 40 yards of the fence line on the southeast corner before they turned it, pushed it back, starved the edges until it had nothing left to run on. When it was done, Hazel sat down on the ground. Just sat down, right there in the scorched field, because her legs had decided they were finished making suggestions and had moved directly to demands. Her hands were black with ash, and her face felt tightened and strange, and she was going to cough for a week. Elias sat down next to her, not beside her in some considered way. He just sat down in the burnt grass with his arms on his knees and his head dropping forward, and the two of them sat there in the smell of the aftermath, while Tom Aldrich and the other men walked the fire line at a distance, checking for embers. "Thank you," Elias said. His voice was rough with smoke. "You said that before," she said, "about the fence posts. I mean it more now." She didn't answer that. She turned her right hand over and looked at the palms. The bandaging had come off somewhere in the middle of it. The blisters from the fence posts had reopened and mixed with new damage from the sack and the heat, and the overall picture was not good. Elias looked at her hands. His expression did something complicated. "I have some salve," he said. "Inside." "I know you do. I bought it." Something almost like a laugh moved across his face, brief, exhausted, real. Tom Aldrich came over. He was a big man, weathered the way outdoor men get, with a white scar along his jaw from something he'd never explained to anyone's satisfaction. He looked at the two of them sitting in the burned field and then looked back at the fire line. "That started in 3 places," he said. He said it flat, no inflection. Elias looked up. "Say that again." 3 separate start points. I found them walking the edge. You can see the pattern, the burns different at each origin, spread outward from 3 distinct spots about 60 yards apart. Tom looked at him steadily. Grass fires don't start in 3 places at once from natural causes. The silence that followed was the loudest kind. "I'm going to need you to write that down," Hazel said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, steady, but from a distance. "What you saw, where the origin points were, what the burn pattern looks like. Everything." Tom Aldrich looked at her. He had the expression of a man weighing something. "I don't want trouble with Granger," he said. Not defensively, just as a fact he was putting on the table. "I know you don't," Hazel said. "Neither do we. But someone started this fire on Elias's land 11 days after we filed documentation of his water rights at the county office. And if we don't make a record of what happened while the evidence is still on the ground, there won't be evidence by morning." Tom looked at the burned line. He looked at Elias. He looked at Hazel's hands. "You got paper?" he said finally. Hazel reached into her satchel, which she'd thrown in the wagon that afternoon out of habit, and which was therefore present and largely undamaged, which was one of the few things that had gone right today. She produced paper and a pencil. Tom Aldrich wrote a statement. It took him a while. He was not a natural writer, but what he produced was specific and clear, the statement of a man who'd seen something and was describing it without interpretation, which was exactly the kind of statement that held up. He signed it, dated it, handed it back. "I'll testify to it," he said, "if it comes to that." He said it like a man who'd decided something and was going to live with it. "It ain't right. What's been happening to you? I should have said something before this." He looked at the burned field. "I should have said something a long time ago." He went back to his wagon. The other men began leaving too, one by one, with nods toward Elias that contained more than nods usually did. When they were gone, Elias and Hazel sat in the quiet of the ruined pasture. 3 origin points, he said. "Yes. He did this because we went to the county office. He did this because we went to the county office, and he knows the notation is going through, and he's running out of quiet options." Hazel carefully folded Tom Aldrich's statement and put it in the satchel with everything else. This wasn't just property damage. This was a message. "I know what it was." A long pause. An owl somewhere in the darkness of the unburned tree line. The smell of the evening underneath the smell of the fire, grass and creek water, and late summer. What do we do with the statement? Elias asked. We go back to Harlan's mill. Sooner this time, not Thursday. Tomorrow morning. She looked at him in the near dark. Tom's statement, the access records showing Decker reviewed your deed before approaching you about selling, the cattle payment discrepancies, and a formal complaint filed about destruction of private property. She paused. We build a record, a real one, thick enough that it can't be quietly made to go away. Elias nodded, slowly. And if Granger comes back harder? He asked. Not as defeat, as honest accounting. Then we have a record of that too, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Claire is going to need her pasture back, he said, when she's old enough to run in it. It was such a specific thing to say, such an Elias Rowan thing to say. Not about himself, not about victory or justice, but about a particular grass field and a particular child who would one day be old enough to run in it. Hazel felt something move through her that wasn't sadness and wasn't happiness, but was in the neighborhood of both. Then we'd better make sure she gets it, she said. They sat there a little longer, not talking, the burned field around them cooling in the August night, the creek, unburned, intact, its water rights now formally in the process of being documented at the Harlan's Mill County office, moving in the darkness beyond the fence line, with the patient indifference of water that's been running through the same channel since before any of them had names. Hazel's hands hurt. Her knees hurt. Her lungs still tasted like smoke and wood for days. She thought about Tom Aldrich writing his statement in the dark with borrowed paper and a pencil he'd kept pressing down on too hard because he was not a practiced writer, but he was trying to get it right. She thought about the specific weight of people deciding, late and imperfectly, to do the thing they should have done earlier. She thought about Martha Granger's gloves, her precise, deliberate fingers, the careful way she'd said, I am not telling you anything. There were more people in this town who knew things than were currently saying things. The question was what it would take to get them to say them. Hazel suspected she was about to find out what that looked like. She stood up. Her knees registered strong protest. She ignored them because they were going to do that regardless, and there was nothing to be done about it but stand anyway. Come on, she said to Elias. Let's get the horses settled and look at those hands of yours. He looked at his own hands as if he'd forgotten they were there. Yours are worse, he said. Mine usually are. She picked up the satchel. That's generally how it goes when you grab the hot end. He stood up, looked at her for a moment in the dark with an expression she couldn't quite read in the low light, something complicated and quiet and not finished resolving itself. Hazel, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Not tonight. Tonight we look at the hands and you tell me what salve you have, and we figure out what time to leave in the morning. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. They walked back toward the house. Behind them, the burned field was just a dark shape against a darker sky, and the creek kept moving through the unburned grass along its banks, and somewhere out past the tree line an owl had found what it was looking for and gone quiet. They were back in Harlan's mill by 7 the next morning. Hazel's hands were wrapped in clean cloth, and her lungs still felt like the inside of a smokehouse. But she had the satchel, she had Tom Aldrich's statement, and she had 4 hours of sleep, which was going to have to be sufficient. Elias drove. He'd barely slept at all. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins with more grip than the horses required. But he hadn't complained, and he hadn't second-guessed, and he'd been ready at the gate when she pulled up in the pre-dawn dark, which was all she'd asked of him. The county building was just opening when they arrived. A different clerk today, older, a woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who wore reading spectacles on a chain and had the unhurried manner of someone who had been filing documents since before most people in Harlan's Mill were born. She looked at what they brought her without surprise, which was itself a kind of relief. They filed a formal complaint of property destruction citing Tom Aldrich's written account of the 3 separate fire origin points. They filed a supplementary notation to the water rights documentation they'd started the week before. They filed a request for official review of the cattle transaction records under the county commerce statutes, which Mrs. Caldwell explained in patient detail was a process that would notify the relevant parties, meaning Granger, that a review had been formally requested. "That last one," Elias said when Mrs. Caldwell stepped away to retrieve a form. "That tells him directly that we're coming." "Yes," Hazel said. "You want that. I want him to know the quiet options are gone, for both of us." She looked at him steadily. "A man who thinks he can still operate in the dark is more dangerous than a man who knows he's been seen." Elias thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. Mrs. Caldwell returned with the form. She looked at them over her spectacles with the expression of a woman who had seen a great many things in a great many years of county business and was making a private assessment of what she was looking at now. "You understand," she said carefully, setting the form on the counter, "that once the Commerce Review request is filed, this office is required to notify all parties named in the filing within 10 business days." "I understand," Elias said. "And you understand that formal notification of this kind—" She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who operates in the narrow space between official neutrality and human decency. "Can sometimes accelerate the timeline of events considerably." "Mrs. Caldwell," Hazel said, "are you trying to tell us something?" The woman looked at her, a long, level look over the spectacles. "I am doing my job," she said, "which is to ensure that the people who file documents with this office understand what those documents set in motion." A pause. "I am very thorough about that part of my job." She pushed the form across the counter. They filed it. The 10 days that followed were the strangest Hazel could remember in recent years. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. She'd expected immediate retaliation. More fence posts, maybe. Another note. Something from Granger's direction that said he knew what they'd done and had a response prepared. But the days passed and the response didn't come, and the absence of it was somehow worse than the thing she'd been bracing for. Silence from a man like Silas Granger wasn't peace. It was calculation. She went about her regular life with the particular alertness of a person who knows something is coming and doesn't know from which direction. She checked her property lines. She kept her wagon in good repair. She visited the Rowan homestead every other day, which was now such an established pattern that Agnes Pruitt, who had taken to dropping in on Thursday afternoons with her own opinions about Clara's developmental progress, had simply incorporated it into her own schedule as a fixed fact. Clara was 7 months old now and had the personality of someone who had decided the world was interesting and intended to investigate all of it. She grabbed at everything within reach: spoons, ledger pages, the fringe on Hazel's shawl, with a democratic enthusiasm that made no distinction between important objects and unimportant ones. She had started making a sound that might have been attempting to be a word or might have been pure experiment. Either way, she made it constantly and with great conviction. Elias watched his daughter with the specific expression of a man who has been surprised by something and hasn't recovered from it yet. Not unhappily, the opposite of unhappily. "She's going to be a talker," Hazel said one afternoon, watching Clara attempt to narrate a wooden spoon. "Eleanor talked constantly," Elias said. He said his wife's name easier now than he had before. Talked through every problem she ever had. Said thinking out loud was how she knew if a thought was real or just a feeling in disguise. Hazel smiled at that. That's a distinction worth making. She was good at those. He was quiet for a moment. Distinctions. Hazel picked up Clara, who immediately grabbed her collar. "Elias," she said, not looking at him, using the casual tone she used when she wanted to say something real without making it larger than it needed to be. "Whatever comes next with Granger, I want you to know I'm not doing it for the land, or the water rights, or because I think I'm owed anything for what I've put into this." He didn't answer right away. "I know that," he said. "I want to make sure you know it, because things are going to get louder before they get quiet, and I don't want either of us to lose the thread of why we started." He was looking at the floor the way he did when he was working something out. "The formula," he said. 32 cents on a counter." 32 cents on a counter, she agreed. Clara pulled Hazel's collar hard enough to make a statement about it. "Ow," Hazel said mildly to Clara, who looked fascinated by this result and filed it away for future research. Elias looked up then, and there was something in his face. Not amusement exactly, but the thing that lives adjacent to amusement in a man who hasn't felt it much lately. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. The notification arrived at Silas Granger's property on a Wednesday. Hazel knew this because Tom Aldrich's farm sat between the county road and the Granger estate, and Tom had seen the county messenger ride through and had sent his eldest son over to tell Hazel, which was the kind of informal intelligence network that assembled itself in rural communities when people started paying attention to the right things. By Thursday, the town had an atmosphere. There was no other word for it. Redstone Crossing felt different in its bones, the way it feels different before a storm, that same low-pressure drop that makes everything slightly sharper and slightly more waiting. People talked differently in the post office. There were conversations that stopped when Hazel walked in and started again in a different register when she'd passed. What she noticed most was the absence of Silas Granger himself from the places he usually occupied. The man was a fixture, sat at the same table in the same saloon every Friday evening, presided over the stockyard auctions on the second Tuesday of every month, appeared at church socials with Martha on his arm. He was present. He was always present. That Thursday and Friday, he wasn't. Hazel thought about that. A man who withdraws isn't a man who's given up. A man who withdraws is a man who's planning the move he wants to make when he's ready to make it. She was proved right on Saturday morning when Decker came to her property. Not to Elias's, to hers. He pulled up in a smart buggy. Not the working wagon he'd used before, a proper buggy with a good horse, the kind of vehicle that said this visit is official, and stood at her gate with his hat in his hands and a careful expression on his face. Hazel saw him from the kitchen window. She finished her coffee. She put on her coat because it had gotten cool overnight, and she wasn't going to stand in her own yard underprepared. Then she went out. "Mrs. Mercer," Decker said. "Mr. Decker." He was a compact man, mid-40s, with careful eyes and the kind of stillness that suggested he'd learned to control his physical responses. He wasn't comfortable, but he was managing his discomfort effectively, which told her he'd done this kind of errand before. "Mr. Granger would like to meet with you," he said. Hazel looked at him. "Would he?" she said. "He feels there may have been some misunderstandings that a direct conversation could resolve." "What specifically does he believe has been misunderstood?" Decker kept his expression even. "I'm not in a position to speak to the specifics. Mr. Granger would prefer to do that himself, in person, at your mutual convenience." "Where?" "His office. At the estate." Hazel thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. "Tell Mr. Granger," she said, "that I'd be glad to meet with him at Calhoun's store, Tuesday at 10, in public." Something moved briefly across Decker's face. "Mr. Granger generally prefers—" "I know what Mr. Granger generally prefers," Hazel said pleasantly. "Calhoun's store, Tuesday at 10. He can send word through you if that doesn't suit him." Decker put his hat back on. He looked at her with the expression of a man revising an assessment he'd made earlier. "I'll relay your terms," he said. He said terms as if he hadn't planned to use that word, but found it was the accurate one. He drove away. Hazel went back inside. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time she reached the kitchen, which she took as progress. She told Elias that same afternoon. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. "You should take someone with you," he said when she'd finished. "I'm thinking Tom Aldrich," she said. "He's already signed his name to something. He's past the point of neutrality." "I'll come." "You shouldn't. Granger is going to try to make this about you. Your land, your debt, your situation." She said the word the way Decker had said it to Elias months ago, with full awareness of the weight it carried. If you're in the room, he can direct everything at you and away from what he's actually done. "I want him looking at me." Elias didn't like it. She could see him not liking it, the way you can see a door being held shut from the inside. "Hazel, I'm not fragile," she said. "I know you know that. I need you to act like you know it." A pause. He looked at the table, then back at her. "Tom Aldrich, and who else?" he said. "Agnes Pruitt's youngest son works at the land office in Harlan's Mill. He's not a lawyer, but he knows the statutes. I'm going to ask him to come as a formal witness." She paused. And I'm going to write everything down beforehand, everything we have, every document, every date, every discrepancy. So there's a written record of what I walk in there with before the meeting even starts." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've already been planning this," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "Since Mrs. Caldwell told us the notification would accelerate the timeline." She met his eyes. "I knew he'd come. I just didn't know which direction." Elias was quiet for a moment. "He came to your house," he said. "Not mine." "Yes." "He thinks you're the one running this." "He's not entirely wrong," she said. Another pause. Something moved across his face. Not quite pride, but in that territory. He didn't name it, and she didn't ask him to. "All right," he said. "Tom Aldrich, Agnes's son. And you write everything down." "I'll write everything down," she confirmed. Clara, from the floor where she'd been investigating a wooden block with great seriousness, made a sound that might have been agreement. Both of them looked at her. The absurdity of the moment broke something slightly, the way absurdity sometimes does when everything else is very heavy. "She's voting," Elias said. "Smart girl," Hazel said. "She's voting for the right side." Silas Granger agreed to Calhoun's store. The message came back through Decker by Sunday evening. Terse, one line confirming Tuesday at 10. Hazel spent Monday writing. She sat at her kitchen table from early morning to past supper with her account books and her copied records and Tom's statement and everything she'd assembled over months. And she wrote it all out in order, chronological, factual, without interpretation, the way you write things when you want them to be understood and not contested on the grounds of emotion. Her handwriting was neat and grew neater as the hours went on, the way her handwriting always did when she was concentrating hard on something else. She wrote out the 32 cents. She wrote out the formula exchange. She wrote out the first soup visit and what she'd found in the ledgers. She wrote out the access records from the county office, Decker's 2 visits under his mother's name. She wrote out the cattle price discrepancies with dates and amounts and the total. She wrote out the fence posts, the ladies' auxiliary meeting, the note on the post, the conversation with Martha Granger. She was careful with that one, careful not to attribute anything specific to Martha that Martha hadn't explicitly said. She wrote out the fire, the 3 origin points, Tom's account word for word. She wrote out every county filing in chronological order. When she finished, it was 11 pages. She read it from the beginning, made 2 corrections, added a line she'd forgotten about the creek access measurements. Then she made a second copy, slower, more careful, and put the original in the satchel and the copy in a separate place that was not the satchel. She went to bed at midnight. She lay in the dark and thought about nothing specific, which was the mental equivalent of not thinking, which was the closest thing to sleep she was going to get. After a while, she did sleep. Not deeply, but enough. She was up before light. Calhoun's store on a Tuesday morning at 10 was not empty, which was predictable, and was also, Hazel understood, the whole point. Word had moved through Redstone Crossing in the way word moved in small towns. Not announced, not written down, just absorbed into the general consciousness, until half the population knew that something was happening at Calhoun's at 10 on Tuesday and had arranged to be somewhere nearby. Some people were inside the store pretending to shop. More were on the street outside, finding reasons to be in front of windows. Harold Calhoun himself was behind his counter with the expression of a man who very much wanted to be somewhere else, but had been born to his particular fate. Tom Aldrich was already there when Hazel arrived, standing near the dry goods, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd made a decision and was committed to its consequences. Agnes Pruitt's son, James, 26, with his mother's directness and his father's large hands, was beside him with a notebook and a pen. Silas Granger arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, which was the kind of punctuality that announced itself as power. He was a large man, not fat, just occupying more space than average, with a face that had been arranged by 60 years of getting what he wanted into an expression of settled authority. He wore a good coat. He came alone, which surprised Hazel, and then didn't. He'd left Decker outside. She could see him through the window, waiting with the buggy. Granger looked around the store, looked at Tom Aldrich, looked at James Pruitt, looked at Hazel. Whatever he'd expected, she suspected it wasn't quite this. Not the quiet readiness of it. Not the notebook. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was the voice of a man used to rooms settling when he spoke. "Mr. Granger, She gestured to the two chairs Calhoun had set out near the counter, under circumstances he was probably still uncertain about. "Thank you for coming." He sat. She sat. Tom and James stayed standing, slightly back. The store breathed around them. "I want to resolve this misunderstanding," Granger said. He said misunderstanding with the confidence of a man who'd used the word enough times to believe it. "I'd like that too," Hazel said. "Can you tell me which part you believe has been misunderstood?" His eyes moved over her face, assessing. He had a practiced look, not unkind, but measuring. The look of a man who'd won a great many conversations by understanding early what the other person wanted and finding the most efficient way to give them enough of it to get what he needed in return. "The Rowan property," he said. "I think there's been some confusion about the water rights situation along the Eastern Creek. I want to be clear that my interest in the property is purely commercial. Your buyer reviewed the Rowan deed at the Harlan's Mill Records office in November of last year," Hazel said, "and again in February, both times under the name D. Calhoun, which is Daniel Decker's maternal family name." She opened the satchel. "These are the access records from the county office." She placed them on the counter between them. He reviewed the deed before coming to Mr. Rowan's property to tell him the water rights were disputed, which the deed makes plain they are not. Silence. Not the store-settling silence of when Granger had walked in. A different kind. She placed the next document on the counter. "These are 18 months of cattle purchase records, cross-referenced with the standard market rates for the region. The total discrepancy is $63.14. She looked at him. "Across enough transactions that it might not be obvious unless someone laid them all out." Granger's face had gone very still. Not the stillness of a man with nothing to say, the stillness of a man choosing precisely what to say next. "Those are business records between my operation and Rowan," he said carefully. "If there are discrepancies, they can be reviewed through They are being reviewed through proper channels," Hazel said. "We filed the Commerce Review request 8 days ago. You received official notification on Wednesday." She set down the filing receipt. "This is our copy of that filing." From somewhere in the watching store, someone shifted their weight. A floorboard creaked. Granger looked at the documents on the counter between them. Then he looked up at Hazel. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and his voice had changed. Not dramatically, but the warmth that had been performing in it was gone now, and what was underneath was more honest, which in its own way she found almost preferable. "What is it you want?" "I want the overpayment to Elias Rowan corrected. I want the water rights to be formally, publicly acknowledged as his without dispute. I want the fence line on the north pasture to be left alone." She paused. "And I want the name of whoever you hired to set 3 fires on his eastern pasture on the night of August 23rd. The air in the store went very specific. Granger looked at her for a long moment. A calculation was happening behind his eyes. She could see it the way you can see fish moving beneath water, the shape of it without the detail. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Tom Aldrich walked the fire line that night and found 3 origin points 60 yards apart," Hazel said. "His written account is in the county record as of last Friday, along with a formal property destruction complaint." She looked at him. "If you'd like to call Tom Aldrich a liar, you're welcome to do that. He's standing right there." Every head in the store turned toward Tom Aldrich. Tom Aldrich stood with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and looked at Silas Granger with the particular expression of a man who has crossed a line and knows he's crossed it and is not going back. "I'll testify to what I saw," Tom said. Quietly. Clearly. Granger looked at Tom for a moment, then back at Hazel. Something in his face was working, something she couldn't entirely read. Not fear, not quite, but something in the same county as it. "I'll need time to review these figures," he said, meaning the cattle records. His voice had settled into the register of a man managing a retreat without calling it one. "Of course," Hazel said. "The Commerce Review Board will be in contact with your office within 30 days. She began placing the documents back in her satchel in the order she'd removed them. "I don't require anything from you today, Mr. Granger. I just wanted to have this conversation while the record was clear about what we both know." He stood. The motion was controlled, deliberate. He was not a man who showed damage easily, and he was not showing it now. But Hazel had been watching people her whole life, and she could see the hairline fractures in the performance, the places where the authority was having to work harder than it was used to. He looked at the store around him, at the people who had needed to be somewhere near Calhoun's at 10 on a Tuesday, at Harold Calhoun behind his counter, whose expression suggested profound regret at having been born in this particular location. "Good day, Mrs. Mercer," Granger said. "Good day," she said. He walked out. The store held its breath for 2 full seconds after the door closed behind him. Then Tom Aldrich exhaled, which broke the seal, and 3 people started talking at once, and Harold Calhoun found something very important to do with his ledger, and James Pruitt wrote one final note in his notebook with the satisfied pressure of a period at the end of a long sentence. Hazel sat still for a moment after it was over. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the counter where she'd laid out 11 pages of documented truth in front of the most powerful man in Redstone Crossing, and he had not been able to dismiss a single one of them. She was waiting to feel something. Relief, maybe, or victory. What she felt instead was tired and alert, and very clear-eyed about the fact that a man like Silas Granger doesn't leave a room like that and go home and decide it's finished. He leaves a room like that and goes home and decides what comes next. Tom came over. He looked at her with an expression that contained both respect and the particular sobriety of a man who's put himself in the path of something large. That went, he searched for the word. Better than it could have, Hazel said. Not as well as it needed to. He nodded. He understood that. What now? James Pruitt asked. He had his notebook closed under his arm, his pen tucked into his pocket. Now we wait, Hazel said, and we don't let our guard down for a single day while we're waiting. She stood and picked up the satchel. And we make sure everyone in this room remembers exactly what was said here today. She looked around at the store, at the faces of people who had watched, who had heard, who had been present. Some of them met her eyes, some didn't, but they'd been here. They knew what was in those documents. They'd watched Silas Granger look at evidence of what he'd done and walk out of the room without a single counter-argument that held. That was not nothing. She walked out into the September morning. The air smelled like the turn of the season coming. Not quite yet, but on its way. That specific note in the atmosphere that says summer has made its decision to leave and is beginning the paperwork. She thought about Martha Granger, about the gloves, the careful words, the pale eyes that didn't miss things. She thought, there are things happening in that house that I don't know about, and I think I'm going to need to know them. She walked to her wagon. She put the satchel on the seat beside her. She sat for a moment before picking up the reins, looking at the front of Calhoun's store, at the same door where, months ago, a young man had walked out with a sick baby, and the beginning of something neither of them had understood yet. She picked up the reins. She drove toward the Rowan property because Elias was waiting to hear what had happened, and Clara would have discovered something new and important since yesterday, and the burned pasture had started to show the first faint green of regrowth along its edges in the way that land does when you give it half a chance. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. But she'd walked into that room with the truth in a satchel and laid it on the counter, and Silas Granger had looked at it and hadn't been able to make it go away. For today, that was enough. The green came back slowly. That was the thing about burned land. It didn't announce its recovery. It didn't come back all at once in some dramatic reversal that made you feel the story had a shape. It came back the way most real things came back, quietly, unevenly, in patches that you had to look for if you wanted to see them. One morning in late September, Hazel was walking the fence line on the eastern pasture with Elias and Clara strapped to his chest in the flour sack carrier, and she looked down and saw a thin line of new green pushing up through the black-gray ground, and she stopped walking. Look, she said. Elias looked down. He was quiet for a moment. It's not much, he said. No, she agreed, but it's there. He crouched down, carefully, because of Clara, adjusting his weight so the baby didn't swing, and touched the edge of the new growth with one finger. Just touched it. The way you touch something you're not sure is real yet. Clara reached down from her position on his chest and grabbed for it too, her small hand opening and closing on air because she was still 6 inches short of reaching the ground. She wants it, Hazel said. She wants everything, Elias said. He stood up. He was looking at the line of green with an expression that had several things in it at once: relief and grief, and something that hadn't quite resolved into a name yet. Eleanor used to say that about her, before she was even born, when she was still... He stopped. She used to say she could feel that the baby was going to be a grabber, someone who reached for things. She was right, Hazel said. She usually was. He looked at the line of green for another moment. Then he looked at Hazel. The Commerce Review Board sent a letter yesterday. She'd been waiting for this. And? They're coming in 6 weeks, full audit of the Granger cattle operations transaction records going back 4 years. He said it without triumph, just as information. 4 years. Hazel thought about that. 4 years meant this wasn't just about Elias. 4 years of records meant there were other ranchers, other transactions, other discrepancies that may or may not have been as carefully hidden as the ones in his books. Did you tell Tom Aldrich? She asked. Yesterday. He went quiet for a long time. Elias paused. Then he said he thought maybe he should get his own records looked at. How many others do you think there are? She asked, though she had her own estimate. I don't know. Granger's been buying cattle in this valley for 12 years. A pause. 12 years is a long time to take a penny here and 2 cents there. They walked the rest of the fence line without talking much. Clara fell asleep somewhere along the southern edge, her head dropping sideways with the absolute commitment of a baby who has decided sleep is happening right now regardless of circumstances. Hazel watched her sleep. The small face, the total trust of it. The fact that this child had started her life making a thin, reedy sound in a general store that had made Hazel put 32 cents on a counter and was now here, alive and gaining weight, and reaching for new grass with her whole hand. There were days when Hazel thought about that chain of events and found it almost too precise to be comfortable. Not because it felt lucky. It didn't feel lucky. It felt like the way things go when people stop looking away at the moment that requires them to look directly. Book tip. The Frontier Founders Festival happened the second weekend of October, the way it happened every year. 3 days of the town gathering itself together to celebrate its own survival, which was not a small thing in a place that had nearly not survived several times. There were food stalls and fiddle music and a horse exhibition on the Saturday that drew people from 2 counties over, and a general atmosphere of communal goodwill that Hazel had always found slightly performative and also genuinely moving, which was a contradiction she'd made her peace with. This year, it felt different. Not worse. Just different in the way a room feels different when everyone in it knows something has shifted and nobody has quite said so out loud yet. Silas Granger arrived on Saturday afternoon with Martha on his arm and 3 of his ranch hands trailing at a respectful distance. He was dressed well. He smiled at people who greeted him. He was performing the role of Silas Granger, respected community pillar, with the polished efficiency of long practice. But the performance had gaps in it now. Small ones. Hazel noticed them the way you notice things when you've been paying close attention for months. The way certain conversations cut off when he approached. The way 2 ranchers on the far side of the fairground looked at each other when Granger walked past them. The way Harold Calhoun, who had always greeted Granger with the enthusiasm of a man grateful for powerful proximity, now found something to do with his hands when their paths crossed. Word had moved, the way word always moved in Redstone Crossing, sideways, in fragments, from people who weren't quite talking about it, but were: the Commerce Review, the audit coming, the fire in Tom Aldrich's 3 origin points, the county records with Decker's visits under his mother's name. People knew. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not accurately in every detail. But they knew enough. And knowing enough was changing the specific gravity of the room around Silas Granger in ways he was clearly aware of and working hard to counter. Hazel stayed on the outer edge of things Saturday morning. She ate some pie, which was excellent. She talked to Agnes Pruitt about Clara's latest accomplishments, which Agnes reported with the authority of a woman who had strong opinions about infant milestones. She watched the horse exhibition with genuine interest and felt, for stretches of an hour at a time, almost normal. Like a woman at a festival enjoying a festival, not a woman waiting for the other thing to happen. She found Elias near the stock pens in the afternoon. He had Clara on his hip. The carrier had been abandoned in favor of being held directly, which Clara had been clear about. And he was talking to a man Hazel didn't recognize, a thick-set man in a canvas coat who had the look of someone from the northern farms. Elias saw her and made a small gesture. She came over. Hazel, this is Walt Bridger. He runs 400 acres north of the Dalton Road. Walt Bridger nodded at her. He had a short beard and cautious eyes, and the particular posture of a man who has come to say something he's not sure how to start. Mr. Bridger, Hazel said. Mrs. Mercer. He looked at her directly. I heard you filed a commerce review on Granger's cattle records. Mr. Rowan filed it, she said carefully. I assisted. Going back 4 years, they said. That's my understanding of the scope. Walt Bridger looked at his hands. He had large hands, the backs of them roughed from outdoor work in all seasons. He turned a hat in them, the same way Elias had turned his hat in Calhoun's store, which felt like a long time ago and was also, in some ways, still happening. I've been selling to Granger's operation for 9 years, he said. 9 years, and I never looked hard at the numbers because... He stopped. Started again. Because you don't look hard at the numbers when the alternative is having no buyer at all. I understand that, Hazel said. I looked at my records last week, he said, after Tom Aldrich told me what was in your filing. He looked up. I found things. The festival moved around them, fiddle music from somewhere behind the stock pens, the smell of wood smoke and frying dough, a child running past them at full speed for reasons known only to the child. Can you document what you found? Hazel asked. Already did. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. 9 years, he said again, and in the repetition of it was the weight of 9 years of not knowing something had been taken from him. He held the paper out. She took it. I'll testify to it, he said. The same words Tom Aldrich had used, the same quiet firmness. If it comes to that. It may come to that, she said honestly. Then I'll be there. He put his hat on. I should have said something a long time ago, too. He looked at Elias. You held on when a lot of men would have sold. That... He seemed to be searching for words that fit. That matters. He walked off toward the stock pens. Elias was looking at the paper in Hazel's hand. How many do you think? He said. I don't know yet. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the satchel she had carried to the festival because she had known, on some level, that the festival was going to be more than a festival. But I think the audit is going to be larger than one rancher's records. Clara reached out and grabbed the fringe of Hazel's shawl. Again. She had a specific attachment to the fringe that expressed itself every time Hazel was within arm's reach. She does that every time, Elias said. I know, Hazel said. I've started wearing the shawl on purpose. He looked at her when she said that, just looked at her for a moment with an expression that she didn't analyze in the moment because the moment was already full of enough things. What happened at the festival on Sunday was not something Hazel had planned, and not something Granger had planned either, which meant it was the most honest thing that had happened in Redstone Crossing in a long time. It started with Martha Granger. Hazel had seen her across the fairground Saturday, a composed figure in a good wool coat, moving through the festival with the practiced social fluency of a woman who had attended every community event for 30 years and knew exactly how to do it. Their eyes had met once, briefly. Martha had held the look for 1 second, then looked away. On Sunday morning, Hazel arrived early and found Martha already there, standing alone near the cider booth with a cup in her hands, looking at the fairground the way people look at things they're deciding about. Hazel walked toward the cider booth because she wanted cider. This was true. It was also true that she wanted to see what happened when they occupied the same space without the buffer of a room full of watching women or the weight of a formal meeting. Mrs. Mercer, Martha said. Mrs. Granger. Martha looked into her cup. She was wearing her good gloves again. Different pair, same habit. The audit is coming, Martha said. Quietly. Not as a question. Yes, Hazel said. A pause. The festival was still thin at this hour, a few early risers, some of the stall keepers setting up, the smell of cider and the cold October air. There are records I've been keeping, Martha said. Her voice was very even, the way voices are when they're being held to a specific steadiness by effort. In my husband's office. I have access to his files because I manage the household accounts. And some of those accounts overlap with the business accounts. And I have for many years been in the habit of... She stopped. Her thumbs moved over her gloves. I have been very thorough about my household accounts. Hazel was very still. Mrs. Granger, she said carefully, are you telling me something? Martha looked at her directly for the first time. Her pale eyes were completely clear. I am telling you, she said, that I have been keeping very thorough household accounts for 11 years, and that I intend to make those accounts available to the Commerce Review Board when they arrive. She paused. Through my own attorney, independently. The weight of what she was saying settled into Hazel's understanding slowly, and then all at once. Does your husband know? Hazel asked. He does not. A beat. He will. Mrs. Granger? Hazel stopped, started again. What you're describing is significant. Do you understand what it will mean? Martha Granger looked out at the fairground. A longer pause. I have been married to that man for 31 years, she said. 31 years is a very long time to watch something happen and tell yourself it isn't happening. She looked back at Hazel. I am 53 years old. I have perhaps 30 more years in this world if I'm fortunate. I would like those years to be... She chose the word precisely. Clean. Hazel didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure there was a thing to say that fit the exact shape of this moment, so she didn't say the large thing. She said the small, accurate thing. Then we'll make sure the review board knows how to reach you, she said. Martha nodded once. She finished her cider. She set the cup down and walked back toward where her husband was, across the fairground, talking to two men who still wanted to be seen talking to him. Hazel stood at the cider booth for a moment, alone. 31 years. 11 years of keeping very thorough accounts. A woman who had stood in an empty meeting room and said, I am not telling you anything, and had been telling her everything. She got her cider. She walked back toward the festival. She thought, there are things you can plan for and things you cannot, and the thing you cannot plan for is the moment another person decides they've been quiet long enough. What Silas Granger did on Sunday afternoon was the thing a man does when he's watched his control over a situation slipping for 2 months and has decided to make one large move rather than continue the slow retreat. He called attention to himself, which was, in a way, the only weapon he had left. He climbed up onto the platform that had been set up for the mayor's address and the award presentations, an act so direct and presumptuous that it stopped the fairground for a full 30 seconds, people turning to look, conversations ending mid-sentence. He spoke without introduction. He spoke about Redstone Crossing, about the valley, about the families who'd built it and the businesses that sustained it. He spoke about the recent, he used the word recent 4 times, difficulties that certain false accusations and misguided legal actions were causing to the community's stability. He spoke about Mrs. Mercer and Mr. Rowan by name. He didn't accuse them of anything directly, which was careful of him. He implied things. Implied that outside trouble had been invited in by people who didn't understand what they were dealing with. Implied that the Commerce Review was a political action by people with grievances rather than legitimate concerns. He spoke for 8 minutes. He had a good voice. He'd clearly done this kind of thing before. Hazel stood in the crowd and listened to all of it. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She listened the way you listen when you're deciding what is actually being said underneath what is being said. What was being said underneath was, I'm still here. I'm still powerful. Look at me standing on this platform. What was also being said was, I'm afraid of what's in that satchel. When he finished, there was a silence, the kind that comes before either applause or the lack of it. Both are answers. The applause, when it came, was thin, not absent, but thin in the specific way that means some of the people who would have clapped a year ago did not clap now. Hazel walked forward. She didn't plan it, or she planned it in the half second between deciding and doing, which is about as much planning as it deserved. She walked to the edge of the platform. She did not attempt to climb up onto it. She was not going to give him the advantage of height, and she was not going to have a conversation that looked like a fight when she intended it to look like something else entirely. She waited until he looked at her. He looked at her. "Mr. Granger," she said, loudly enough for the fairground to hear. "You said there were misguided legal actions being taken. I want to make sure everyone here understands what those actions actually are, so that nobody's working from a misunderstanding." He looked down at her from the platform. His expression did its best. His best was very good, but it wasn't enough. "The Commerce Review Board will be conducting an audit of cattle transaction records going back 4 years, she said. "That's not a legal action I filed. That's a standard process that began when we presented documented discrepancies to the county office. Tom Aldrich has already stated in a signed document on record at the Harlan's Mill County office that the fire on Mr. Rowan's eastern pasture on the night of August 23rd originated from 3 separate ignition points." She paused. "If anyone here has questions about the official documentation, copies are available. I have them in my bag." She said, "I have them in my bag," the way you say something that makes a larger point by its smallness. Not a dramatic statement, just a fact about what was in her bag. From somewhere in the crowd, she didn't see who, a voice said, "I'd like to see them." Then another voice, "So would I." Granger was still on the platform. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The distance between them, him elevated, her on the ground, should have been his advantage and wasn't. "The review board will speak for themselves when they arrive," Hazel said, still to the crowd rather than to him. "We're not asking anyone to take our word for anything. We've put everything in the official record and we're letting the process work." She looked around the fairground. "That's all." She stepped back. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a correction, offered to a crowd that had just been handed a distortion, and it landed the way corrections land when they're made by someone who has the documents to back them up. Granger stepped down from the platform. He didn't look at her again. He left the festival within the hour, Martha beside him, and people watched him go in the way people watch something they're revising their opinion of in real time. Tom Aldrich appeared at Hazel's elbow. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but the record needed to be clear." He looked at the platform, now empty. "Walt Bridger talked to 3 more ranchers this morning," he said. "They're pulling their records." Hazel exhaled slowly. "How many?" she asked. 7, with Bridger. Could be more. 7 ranchers with documented discrepancies, plus Elias, plus whatever was in Martha Granger's 11 years of very thorough household accounts. The audit that had begun as one man's cattle records was becoming something considerably larger. She thought about Silas Granger building his empire across 12 years, a penny here and 2 cents there, on the assumption that isolated people don't compare notes, that a man with a sick baby and 40 struggling acres is too busy surviving to look closely at his accounts, that a widow everybody's stopped looking at is just someone who wanders through the general store buying lamp oil. The assumption was that invisible people stay invisible. The assumption was wrong. The Commerce Review Board arrived in early November. 3 men from the state capitol with leather satchels and a mandate to spend 2 weeks reviewing records. They stayed for 6. Hazel was called to give a formal statement in the 2nd week. She sat in a rented room at Harlan's Mill across from 2 of the 3 reviewers and answered their questions for 4 hours with her notes in front of her, starting from the 32 cents on the counter at Calhoun's store. She included that because she believed in starting from the actual beginning, through the ledger discrepancies, through the deed access records, through the fire, and Tom's statement through the festival and everything after. The reviewers were thorough, which she appreciated. They asked her to clarify things twice and repeat things 3 times, and she did, without impatience, because thoroughness was the point. Martha Granger gave her own statement separately, through her attorney, a man she'd hired from Wichita using money from accounts her husband didn't know she had. This detail emerged later and became one of those facts that people in Redstone Crossing returned to repeatedly in the years that followed because it contained its own kind of story. Walt Bridger testified. Tom Aldrich testified. 5 of the 7 additional ranchers testified. The other 2 submitted written statements through the county office. The review took 6 weeks. The findings, when they came, were significant enough that the State Attorney General's office opened its own investigation, which was a development that moved through Redstone Crossing like weather, unavoidable, affecting everyone regardless of whether they were ready for it. Silas Granger's political connections proved less durable than he'd spent 30 years believing they were. Some of them held. More didn't. The men who'd built alliances with him based on the assumption of his permanence found, in the specific way that people find things they should have considered earlier, that alliances with a man who is under state investigation required some recalibration. He didn't go to prison. Hazel had understood from early on that a man with his resources and connections probably wouldn't, and she'd made her peace with that not being the goal. The goal was the record. The goal was the audit. The goal was the public exposure of something that had operated on the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention. He repaid Elias the $63.14. He repaid 7 other ranchers, totaling amounts that the state investigation put in writing, but that Hazel never stated publicly, because that was their business, not hers. He formally withdrew any claim or dispute regarding the Rowan property's water rights, and the county filed the withdrawal as an official document which sat in the Harlan's Mill Records office with all the other documents, permanent and unambiguous. He sold the Granger estate in the spring and moved to Wichita. People said various things about this. Hazel said nothing about it because she had nothing to say about a man she'd spent 8 months fighting that she hadn't already put in writing somewhere. Martha Granger did not go to Wichita. Martha Granger rented a small house on the east side of Redstone Crossing with the money from her own accounts and took up teaching at the county school, which was a position she was apparently very well qualified for and which suited her in ways that living in the Granger estate apparently had not. She and Hazel were not friends exactly, but they nodded at each other in the post office with a specific kind of nod that meant something they'd never have to put into words. Elias asked Hazel to marry him on a Wednesday in February, which was not a romantic month in Kansas. The ground was frozen. Clara had a cold and had spent the previous 2 days communicating her displeasure about this clearly and continuously, and Elias had been up most of the night and looked like a man who had not been up most of the night for a flattering reason. He asked her in the kitchen. He was at the stove trying to get the temperature right on the formula, which Clara was now mostly too old for but still wanted on sick days. And Hazel was at the table trying to add a column of figures that kept coming out differently. And he said without turning around from the stove, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said without looking up from the figures. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Permanently. As my wife." He turned around then. He was holding the pan of formula and he looked exhausted and serious and like a man who had rehearsed something and was not using any of the rehearsed version. I know I'm not what anyone would." He stopped, started differently. "I'm asking because I want you here, because Clara wants you here, because the past 8 months have shown me that I am—" He seemed to be choosing words carefully now. "I am significantly better at being a person when you're around." Hazel set her pencil down. She looked at him. This man who had walked into a general store with a sick baby and turned his hat in his hands and held himself together with will and not much else. Who had said she's not Eleanor once, early on, meaning Hazel wasn't, and who had never said anything that minimized that, and who had also never let it become a wall. She thought about what she'd said to him months ago, about spending years doing the quiet thing and the careful thing, and discovering that it hadn't protected her from anything, just made her easier to ignore. She was not easy to ignore anymore. She suspected that was permanent, regardless of what she said next. "Put the pan down," she said. He put the pan down. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, more clearly, because he seemed like he might need it said again. "I'll marry you." He exhaled. She hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath, but he had been, and the exhale of it was so human and unperformed that something in her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. From the back room, Clara made a loud and emphatic sound about her cold. Both of them looked toward the sound. "She has opinions about everything," Hazel said. "She gets it from Eleanor," Elias said. "Or she's developing her own," Hazel said. He considered that. "Fair." They got married in April. Not a large wedding. Tom Aldrich was there, and Agnes Pruitt, and Walt Bridger with his wife, and James Pruitt with his notebook, which he did not actually use but carried out of habit. A few others. The ceremony was at the county office in Harlan's Mill, performed by the Justice of the Peace, who was a practical man and did not embellish. Hazel wore her good blue dress. Elias's good coat still had the smoke smell in the lining from the fire, which he'd tried to get out and hadn't entirely. She noticed it when she stood beside him and thought it was fitting in its way. Clara was held by Agnes Pruitt during the ceremony and watched the whole thing with the focused attention of someone gathering information for future reference. Afterward, they drove home to the Rowan property, her property now too, the deed being something they were going to file a notation on the following week. In the April afternoon, with Clara between them on the wagon seat, doing the thing she did now, which was to grab one of each of their hands simultaneously and hold on with both of hers. The eastern pasture was green. Not a hint of green, not a pale suggestion of recovery. Fully, honestly green. The deep spring green of grass that has come back through burned ground and found it can grow better for the trouble. They didn't comment on it. They didn't need to. The first time Clara said Mama was in June, on a morning when the kitchen windows were open and the air coming through had the specific quality of early summer before the heat arrived. She was standing. She'd been working on standing for 3 weeks, lurching between pieces of furniture with the intense concentration of someone learning a new skill and deeply annoyed that it was taking this long. And she let go of the chair. She stood for a full 3 seconds without holding anything. Then she looked at Hazel, who was at the table, and she said it. Not a babble, not an approximation, clearly. Mama, and reached. Hazel crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and caught her as she started to topple, swept her up before she hit the floor, and stood there with the baby on her hip and her face doing something she couldn't entirely control. She hadn't expected it. She'd thought she'd prepared herself for the various ways this particular moment might or might not arrive, and she had not, in fact, prepared herself at all. Elias was in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd come in from the yard. He was watching her. Clara grabbed Hazel's collar with both hands. The instinct that had been there since the beginning, since the first time Hazel had ever held her, that particular grip that knew before anything else did that this was someone worth holding on to. Mama, Clara said again, with the satisfaction of someone who has filed a point and expects it to be registered. Hazel pressed her face briefly against the top of Clara's head. Just for a moment. She didn't cry because she was not a person who cried easily, and also because the thing she was feeling didn't resolve into crying. It resolved into something quieter, something that sat in the chest and stayed there. She looked up at Elias. He was leaning in the doorway with an expression she had seen variations of for almost a year now. That complicated, real, imperfectly assembled expression that meant more than any of the names for it. She decided, he said. She did, Hazel said. She was always going to. Hazel thought about that. About a baby in a general store, too still against a young father's chest. About 32 cents on a counter in front of a man who had decided that his policy mattered more than a child's life. About the particular chain of moments that leads from one small, unremarkable decision to the place where you're standing right now with a child on your hip who has just decided what to call you. You couldn't plan it. You couldn't engineer it. All you could do was choose, in the moment that required it, to be the person who did not look away. Everything else followed from that. Clara grabbed her collar harder, the way she did when she felt the need to emphasize something. I hear you, Hazel said to Clara quietly. I hear you. She looked at the open window, the June morning coming through it, the green field beyond it, the ordinary, permanent beauty of a piece of land that had been through fire and come back. She had spent a long time being the woman everyone ignored. The woman people looked past in stores, on streets, at meetings, in rooms where they'd decided she didn't quite belong. She had spent a long time carrying that weight around, telling herself it had slid off her like rain off oilcloth, knowing that it hadn't, not entirely, not in the small accumulated way that was its own kind of heaviness. She didn't carry it the same way now. It hadn't vanished. She was clear-eyed enough to know it hadn't vanished, that there would still be rooms and streets and looks and the specific silence of people who had made up their minds. The world did not remake itself completely, not even for the best possible reasons. But she had stood in Calhoun's store and laid truth on a counter and watched the most powerful man in the valley be unable to make it go away. She had put fence posts back in burned ground. She had walked into smoke. She had sat in a county record office and asked questions nobody had thought to ask because they'd assumed there was no one who cared enough to ask them. She had been seen, Not by everyone. Not in the way she'd maybe once imagined being seen, back when she'd been a younger woman with different ideas about what mattered. But by the people who were standing in this kitchen and the ones who'd signed their names to things when it cost them something. And the one on her hip who had just invented a name for her out of whole cloth and was using it with great confidence. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole of it. Clara made another sound. Imperative, editorial, the sound of someone who has things to say and is going to say them. Hazel laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one, sudden and slightly breathless, the kind that surprises you. All right, she said to Clara. I'm listening. And she was.